Adventure through the Appalachian Wind-Keys. Chapter 1. A town beneath the warm Appalachian wind. Evening settled over Asheville in early October, and the small North Carolina city inhaled the season with slow, fragrant breaths. Hearth smoke drifted from brick chimneys, carrying notes of hickory and clove that mingled with the earthy perfume of rain-soaked leaves. Maples, poplars, and sweet gums had been shedding their colors for days, and now the narrow streets lay hidden beneath a patchwork carpet of russet, gold, and ember red. Street lamps flickered to life, their halos glimmering against a rising veil of blue twilight, while in distant hollows the Blue Ridge Mountains darkened to indigo. Lana Parker walked home from Asheville High along a sidewalk polished slick by afternoon drizzle. A worn canvas backpack pressed against her shoulders, and through its fabric she felt the cool pulse of a mountain breeze descending from the ridgeline. It slid over the roofs, rattled the wind chimes of front porches, and slipped beneath the collar of her jacket like a whispered secret. Each gust smelled faintly of creosote pine, distant wood stoves, and the mineral tang of wet granite. When Lana reached the family's weather-gray house on Orchard Street, a single figure waited beside the porch railing. Her cousin, Evan, in town for his fall break, balanced on the bottom step, the toes of his sneakers tracing fallen petals from an overgrown marigold bed. The porch itself was a patchwork of creaking boards, and at its center, a kerosene lantern burned with a steady saffron glow. Its light spilled through the slats, tumbled down onto the brick walkway, and stretched across the ragged lawn where headless sunflowers knocked their hollow stalks together in the breeze. Inside, the house exhaled the comforting sense of cedar closets and old paper, but Lana and Evan climbed beyond the bedrooms and attic ladder, drawn by something older than routine. The attic hatch yielded with a reluctant groan, revealing a dusky loft that smelled of dust, machine oil, and a trace of aviation fuel that no cleaning ever erased. Here, under a steep pitch of rafters, sat 3 leather suitcases mottled by age. Brass tags bore the initials of their grandfather, once a small-town pilot who flew mail runs over the Smokies before airfields kept permanent lights. The suitcases, scuffed by decades of cargo holds, stood like quiet guardians beside a massive wall map. That map dominated the northern gable. Yellowed at the edges and curling at the corners, it displayed the Southern Appalachian chain in muscular relief. Crimson pins pierced the paper at 37 mountain passes, their metal heads catching shards of lantern light. Thread once connected many of the pins, but most of those lines had sagged or snapped, dangling in forlorn arcs that hinted at forgotten flight paths. The cousins' attention, however, drifted to the far end of the attic where shadows folded deepest. There, half hidden behind cedar trunks and an abandoned victrola, lay a circular hatch set into the floorboards. It measured no more than a yard across and resembled the sealed window of a nautical cabin, a porthole caught out of place among rafters and Christmas ornaments. Its surface was brushed steel, dulled yet unblemished by rust, and a single iron handle protruded from its center. From time to time, the hatch stirred with life. A gentle pulse pushed beneath the metal skin, spreading rings of luminescence like breaths under linen. The glow emerged without warning, sometimes during summer thunderstorms when lightning spidered across the ridges, sometimes on still winter nights when the air snapped with cold. It faded as mysteriously, leaving only a memory of pale radiance quivering in the mind's periphery. Their grandfather had called the hatch a wind knot, a phrase he delivered with a private smile while polishing the brass altimeter that never left his study. He never elaborated, never offered an explanation grounded in weather lore or in his years of piloting, yet he kept the hatch locked with a cobwebbed padlock, and he alone held the key, strung on a lanyard beside dog tags from a long-ago war. Since his passing, the key had vanished, and the padlock remained, crusted but firm. Lana moved closer, footsteps muffled by a quilt of forgotten tarpaulins. The lantern in her palm flared against the hatch, scattering copper flecks across its surface. She reached out and laid her fingertips on the cast-iron handle. The metal was unexpectedly warm, as though it harbored heat drawn from distant thermals spiraling above mountain saddles. A faint vibration traveled up her arm, a heartbeat or a distant engine turning somewhere beneath the Blue Ridge. She withdrew her hand, unsettled yet enthralled. Dust motes whirled through the lantern glow like spores searching for seed beds, and from the rafters came the dry rustle of a squirrel nesting for the night. Outside, wind combed the shingles and rattled the attic window, timing its size with the periodic pulse beneath the hatch. The map pins trembled almost imperceptibly, casting wavering crimson dots across the faded contour lines. Blast deepened into night. In the quiet that followed, Asheville's distant streets carried the rumble of last-hour trolleys and the hush of traffic along the French Broad River. Somewhere between those familiar sounds and the uncertain hum beneath the attic boards, Lana sensed an invisible seam opening, a thin border where ordinary autumn evenings gave way to currents older than the town itself. She extinguished the lantern, allowing darkness to seal the loft. Yet even without light, the outline of the hatch lingered before her eyes, stamped in afterglow. The wind knot waited, keeping its silent rhythm beneath the warm Appalachian wind. Chapter 2. A Letter from the Railroad Bridge and the Hickory Casket. Morning mist still clung to the maples when the household creaked awake, and a dew-damp hush lingered over Orchard Street. In the half-light, Lana descended the porch steps to collect the day's mail. The tin mailbox felt chilled under her fingers, its surface beaded with droplets that mirrored the ashen sky. Inside lay a single envelope, thick and cream-colored, unblemished by postage or cancellation. Only 2 characters adorned the front, L, P, and E, B, formed in precise fountain pen script. No other markings revealed origin or intention, and the flap had been sealed with a bead of dark green wax impressed by an imprint she did not recognize. She carried the envelope indoors, where the kitchen lamps cast amber pools across pine flooring. When the wax gave way, she found 3 items arranged with deliberate care. A sliver of beige cardstock scored along one edge as if cut from archival folders, a miniature wooden key no longer than a knuckle, and a bloom of sawdust that hinted at fresh carpentry. The key had been carved from hickory, grain running true, and its bow bore a faint rendition of a 5-point star. Etched on the card in the same meticulous hand stood a lone instruction directing the holders to the abandoned railroad trestle spanning the French Broad River on the town's western margin. All day the summons pressed at the cousins' thoughts. Lessons, chores, and small talk drifted by, unnoticed beneath the steady drumbeat of curiosity. By late afternoon, Clouds unfurled in ragged banners across the blue ridge, and a breeze tasted of rain yet unfallen. They packed a canvas satchel with a thermos of thick cocoa, 2 plaid camp blankets, a coil of paraffin wax candles left from last winter's outage, and a brass-cased flashlight that rattled with fresh batteries. The trek led them beyond the commercial blocks, through the Hickory bottomlands where disused track lines glimmered with rust beneath carpets of sweet gum leaves. Hedge rows from stone pilings sunk decades earlier, each arch scarred by freeze-thaw cycles and overgrown with river birch. Iron trusses stretched across the current in a mute lattice, their rivets bled with oxide and lichen. No train had thundered there since the state decommissioned the spur line, yet the air vibrated with an echo that imagination supplied, the far-off wail of a whistle carried on mountain thermals. Beneath the deck, the French Broad flowed slate blue, combed by driftwood, and ribbons of fog exhaled from its own chilled surface. Pale river light flickered between the ties, illuminating their path with shifting silver. They advanced along the timbers, testing each one before committing weight, and wood groaned under boots that dislodged pellets of rust. Halfway across, vines of trumpet creeper tressed the guardrail, their spent blossoms curled like parchment. Near the bridge's center, where 2 trusses met at a plate marked 1925, the cousins halted. Resting on a crossbeam sat a casket hewn from solid hickory, smoothed and bee-waxed until the heartwood glowed with tawny warmth. An emblem had been carved into the lid, a bald eagle in mid-dive, wings raked backward, talons extended. Its feathers caught the lantern light and seemed alive with motion. The small key answered the lock without hesitation. Tumbler pins yielded with a soft click, and the lid lifted on brass hinges that complained only faintly. A breath of resin escaped, mingling sapwood sweetness with the darker scent of decayed bark that clung to the river gorge. A shallow compartment revealed 3 relics cushioned by folds of oilcloth. First lay a copper monocle rim, its glass intact, though tinted by age to a tea-colored hue. Verdigris traced the knurled edge, yet the optic surface remained clear enough to magnify the grain lines of the wood below. Beside it rested a pocket-sized notebook wrapped in fading olive canvas. Embossed on the cover, half obscured by wear, stood the seal of the United States Forest Service, an evergreen shield beneath crossed axes. When pages were fanned, the paper released a fragrance of brittle cellulose and mountain loam. The third object commanded immediate attention, a filament of smoky quartz no thicker than twine, looped into a loose coil. Microscopic inclusions within the stone caught ambient light and released it as a muted glow, soft as a night crawler's phosphor, yet insistent. When Lana's fingers brushed the crystal, warmth coursed along her clavicle, a thrum synchronized to her heartbeat, faint but undeniable. Curiosity turned to scrutiny as they examined the notebook's final leaf. Pencil scrawl, childlike and energetic, declared a single directive. Open the hatch when the wind blows from Flat Top Mountain, and follow the stone's light. The graphite strokes pressed deeply, leaving ghosts on the reverse page, as though the author feared the words might be lost to time if not carved into paper fiber. Night air thickened around the trestle. Frogs chorused in riparian thickets, and the distant hum of Asheville's avenues dwindled to a hush. Lana sensed again the heat within the quartz thread, an energy pulsing against her palm like a captive breeze. Somewhere in the darkness upriver, Flat Top Mountain loomed unseen, its summit often swept by weather fronts tumbling eastward. She imagined that particular wind funneled down ravines, stirring reeds along riverbanks, winding through the bones of the old bridge until reaching the hidden attic hatch that waited under the gambrel roof on Orchard Street. They secured the artifacts in the satchel, closed the hickory lid, and relocked the casket, leaving it exactly where it had rested. The bridge groaned beneath retreating footsteps, while cool mist climbed from the river to smudge star patterns overhead. On the shore, the cousins paused to pour cocoa into tin cups, steam spiraling upward only to dissolve into the low fog. The quartz filament glowed through the canvas bag, its steady light mirrored by trembling reflections on the French Broad's surface. Somewhere between the hush of the water and the whispered rattle of brittle cattails, the evening drafted a promise of winds yet to rise and latches yet to turn. Chapter 3. Vortex of Luminophores and the Firefly Road. Wind arrived after midnight with no forewarning, lashing through the hollows of Orchard Street until rafters creaked and porch chains rattled like distant chimes. In the upper rooms, the sudden squall pressed against thin panes, making the wooden shutters tremble as though startled from a dream. Beneath the roofline, a faint metallic clink sounded where the attic hatch met its frame, and a muted shimmer, neither moonlight nor lampglow, quickened behind the boards. When Lana climbed the creaking ladder and edged across the dusty planks, she found the round hatch irradiated by a dull, silvery gleam that pulsed in measured intervals, as if the metal inhaled the very wind that howled outside. She slipped the loop of smoky quartz from her pocket, the coil still warm with the memory of river mist and copper dust. The instant the crystal touched the lock's corroded housing, a filament of light migrated from stone to metal. Oxidized copper brightened along ancient etchings. Gears twitched like creatures stirring from hibernation, and hinges sighed in protest before yielding. The heavy lid lifted with deliberate gravity, releasing a gust that smelled of pine resin and cold iron, yet carried no grit of the earthly night. Beyond the hatch there sprawled no attic void or roof tiles, only a slow-turning nebula, opalescent and thick, its complexion shifting through pewter, lavender, and glacial green. Out of that softened radiance burst a flock of insects unlike any Lana had read about in textbooks. They were fireflies in architecture, yet outsized, each matching the span of a human palm. Semi-transparent elytra refracted the hatch's glow into prismatic fragments, while abdomens burned with amber incandescence, bright enough to color the rafters in festival half-light. The swarm rotated in deliberate choreography, carving a hollow spiral through the haze so that deeper vistas glimmered beyond. Among the passing forms, Evan spotted one bearer of a curious mark scorched into the dorsal shell, the small USFS shield, identical to the insignia stamped on the Hickory notebook discovered on the bridge. Recognition clicked between the cousins without the need for words. They stepped together across the threshold. The instant their feet cleared the rim, gravity rewrote its allegiances. Pressure vanished from joints, breath condensed in luminous motes that joined the vortex. Silver fog enfolded cheeks and wrists with alpine chill, yet no dampness clung to clothing. Instead of falling, they felt themselves ferried by a gentle vector, weightless yet guided. Beneath their souls materialized a surface yielding and resilient, reminiscent of moss after summer rain. It carried the fragrance of cedar bark and damp quartz, even though no soil showed through the translucent weave. The hatch shrank behind them into a trembling disk, then dimmed to nothing, swallowed by the radiant murk. Ambient sound altered as surely as atmosphere. The rattle of Asheville gutters, the distant yelp of late-night traffic, all dissolved into a low, resonant surge, akin to surf pounding unseen headlands. Its cadence vibrated along the mossy path, coaxing hair at the nape of the neck to rise in mild apprehension. Ahead, the spiral resolved into a linear procession. A single line of fireflies hovered equidistant from one another, their bodies blinking in perfect serial rhythm. Each burst of amber light traced an ephemeral rail through the fog before fading, leaving a phantom corridor that reawakened with every subsequent pulse. The result resembled twin rails forged from concentric rings of glow, drifting forward in patient invitation. Lana adjusted the satchel at her side, sensing the quartz filament buzz faintly in concert with the insect's rhythm. Evan ran his fingers through the luminous air and watched it swirl back into place with liquid grace. Unspoken accord steered their first steps. The footing remained pliant but reassuring. It neither bounced nor crumbled, instead responding much like packed forest duff. Mist billowed around their calves and parted where their momentum cut through, only to coalesce again behind them, sewing the fabric of the path into seamless continuity. Flashes from the firefly chain intensified the farther they walked, drawing shy tints of rose from the vapor ahead. The horizon, once pewter, now blushed with dawn-like warmth, though no sun disclosed itself. Periodically, a stray firefly drifted closer, orbiting Lana's wrist or Evan's shoulder before rejoining the procession, as though confirming their presence on a manifest. Each brief visitation left a lingering scent of ozone and petrichor, heightening the illusion that they advanced through an airborne understory rather than a roofless sky. Time loosened its regularity. Whether minutes or hours unfolded, the progression felt suspended, measured only by inhalations and the cyclic flare of insect lanterns. Yet, imperceptibly, the underlying hum of the distant forest grew louder, resolving into layered textures, calls of unseen insects, the tremolo of frogs, the brittle chatter of nightbirds settling before some unseen brightness. The moss underfoot thickened, springier now, studded with glints like mica grains. Lana realized these were seeds of light, minute static sparks that embedded in the living carpet, waiting for the pressure of passing feet to ignite brief pinpricks of gold. Bathscorder bowed leftward and widened, revealing glimpses beyond the veil, a massive silhouette of hardwood trunks and braided boughs brimming with bioluminescent lichen. The fireflies divided, arraying themselves into twin constellations that arched overhead, forming a vaulted gateway. Inside that aperture glimmered a more concentrated radiance, steady and purposeful, recalling the quartz's internal glow, yet grander in scale. The air smelled of damp loam and distant thunder. Lana felt the warmth in her stones surge as though aligning with a beacon hidden within the forest ahead. She sensed that the invisible coastline of sound they had trailed was about to crash upon their shore. They halted at the threshold, breath clouding faintly and colder currents descending from the treetops. Behind them, the path they had traveled receded into quiet darkness. The last firefly flicker snuffed like a lantern at closing time. Before them, a hush reigned, pregnant with foliage rustle and the hush of something waiting to name itself in the coming glow. Chapter 4. Mrs. Whitaker's Laboratory and the Clocks of Wind. The bioluminescent chain of fireflies dissolved at the edge of a circular glade where moonlit grasses pressed flat as though smoothed by an unseen vortex. At the glade's center rose a tulip poplar of improbable girth, its buttressed roots spreading like docks along a miniature harbor. Between two of the largest roots, a pointed arch had been sawn and sanded into the trunk itself, forming a doorway whose frame was polished until it mirrored the shifting gleam of firefly light. A low exhalation threaded through the opening, carrying the mingled aromas of labdanum resin, hot maple syrup, and fresh machine oil, scents that merged oddly yet promised craftsmanship and warmth. Beyond the threshold lay a circular workshop excavated directly into the living wood. Sapwood walls shimmered green, illuminated by clusters of phosphorescent lichens cultivated in latticed niches. Suspended from birch rafters, rows of delicate glass flasks chimed with each breath of air that passed them. Every vessel contained a captured wind, swirling in perpetual confinement. One flask held the ochre-tinted fury of a Mojave dust storm. Nearby, a bottle cradled a soft Atlantic zephyr, the color of early dawn. Some winds slept in a calm, translucent hush, while others roiled restlessly, rattling their cork stoppers in rhythmic complaint. Cedar workbenches fanned around a central plinth, each crowded with precision instruments, brass anemometers no larger than thimbles, tuning forks blued by heat, vials of powdered quartz, and coils of argent thread. At the foremost bench stood Mrs. Whitaker, the workshop's curator. Though her ranger's uniform had been retired to a peg near the door, the posture of long mountain patrols remained in the set of her shoulders. Under a magnifying loupe, she guided a needle tipped with electrum, weaving filaments of silver wind thread into the exposed gears of an open-pocket chronometer. With every new strand, the watch's balance wheel pulsed, inhaling faint drafts that fluttered the pages of logbooks stacked beside her. Shelves behind the bench displayed weather charts cross-hatched with redirections and anomalies. Mountain downdrafts spiraled across plains, coastal breezes pooled in inland basins, and errant trade winds looped back on themselves like lengths of unraveling ribbon. Thin lines of graphite linked these deviations to a symbol penciled at the margin, a stylized compass rose encircled by 7 dots. Atop the charts rested a cracked porcelain plaque bearing the insignia of the National Park Service, a relic of Mrs. Whitaker's field days when she had roamed sky roads to harvest wild winds for research balloons and firebreak lines. She paused to test the refurbished chronometer. When the minute hand reached the mark-etched Mountain Noon, all motion within the watch ceased, yet the casing vibrated as though a breeze flowed inward rather than out. A breath of alpine chill spilled across the bench, scattering curls of metal filing. The phenomenon lasted only a heartbeat before the hands ticked onward and the air stilled. Satisfied, she placed the instrument in a cedar cradle beside a spool wound with pale quartz filament, whose core glowed like fog, backlit by sunrise. Blueprints unfurled across a drafting table outlined the next phase, a transit to a pocket valley hidden within northern Arizona's desert strata, the secret keep of the Compass Rose Sphere, an ancient gyroscopic regulator rumored to anchor the global lattice of winds. Without its recalibration, The eastern face of the Appalachians would slide toward arid ruin as misrouted jet streams stripped the ranges of moisture and shadowed hollers with dust. Only the newly forged clock of wind, synchronized at mountain noon and guided by a tether of living quartz, could open the brief corridor between biomes. Should the escort thread sever, the corridor would close like a snuffed lantern, leaving travelers stranded between atmospheres. A satire stitched from waxed hickory bark, holding field compasses, barometric tablets, and a map whose ink shimmered when exposed to moving air. Near the door, a rack of wind flasks clinked gently, each one tagged with coordinates for future reseeding once the sphere was restored. Outside, the glade rustled under restless breezes that no longer belonged, as though the very forest leaned toward the workshop in anticipation of the journey being set in motion. The sand valley and the rusted locomotives of air. When the hour hand of the wind clock reached the narrow mark engraved mountain noon, the entire trunk workshop quivered like a drum reflecting distant thunder. Sapwood beams flexed without cracking, and a hush fell over the rows of bottled storms. At the precise center of the cedar floor, a translucent oval unfolded, its edges sweeping outward until they brushed the hoar-frosted anemometers. The interior of the aperture glimmered with suspended particles the color of hammered bronze, drifting in slow eddies that never settled. A faint metallic chord, neither whistle nor bell, rose from the opening and held its pitch, inviting entry. Mrs. Whitaker secured the wax hickory satchel across her shoulder, checked the tension in the quartz filament tied to the wind clock, and stepped through. Lana followed, the copper monocle looped on a lanyard against her chest. While Evan closed the line, the last firefly perched on his collar like a badge of living amber. Instant translocation replaced woody darkness with a white brilliance. They now stood on a slab of veined onyx hovering 50 feet above a desert basin that stretched beyond every horizon. Heat radiated from below, turning the air into liquid glass. Despite the oppressive glare, the travelers sensed movement far beneath. Pale cyclones roamed the basin floor, each hundreds of feet tall, cylinders of dust whose surfaces folded and refolded as though built from parchment. They resembled locomotive engines stripped of boilers and rails, their pistons made of slow thunder, their smokestacks exhaling nothing but scalded silence. Some slanted sideways, collided, and sheared apart before recongealing into new spirals. Others stalled mid-rotation and disintegrated into lazy sheets that drifted toward the basin rim. The entire valley seemed powered by a faulty timetable that no longer synchronized its machinery. At the basin's heart rose a low dome, the color of carnelian, burnished by centuries of airborne grit. Fine fissures crawled across its curved surface, tracing the pattern of a compass rose, north and secondary bearings rendered in faint gold. Lana recognized the dome at once. The rose sphere, origin point of continental jet streams, now dulled and choking under unfiltered heat. Yet between the onyx platform and that objective sprawled a belt of breathing dunes. These mounds inflated as if filled by subterranean bellows, then sighed downward until they nearly vanished, only to rise again higher than before. Each cycle altered footholds and crests, transforming the landscape into a shifting lung that exhaled sand instead of air. The fireflies that had escorted them since the attic emerged from Lana's satchel, forming a coronet of light around the group. Their steady glow diluted to blinding white and painted a path of overlapping halos down to the basin floor. Mrs. Whitaker urged haste. She instructed Lana to attach the quartz thread's free end to the wind clock's minute hand. Once contact was made, an ivory beam shot forward from the clock, arching over the dunes and terminating against the carnelian dome. The line wavered whenever a dune breathed inward, revealing safe spans of compaction and warning of the moments when sand would liquefy. Descending from the onyx ledge required trust. The first step plunged them ankle-deep into scorching grains that slid like ball bearings. Yet the quartz beam brightened to indicate stability. They advanced in pulses, 3 strides over firm ridges, pause, then 2 leaps, just as the ground softened. When a mound exhaled too quickly, Evan sank to his knees, the dune sucking at his boots as though eager to add him to its mineral lungs. Lana hauled him free, and the trio hustled forward before the sand collapsed into its own hollow. Their shadows shortened as they neared the sphere, where temperature spiked and the scent of heated iron mingled with an ozone taint unique to misdirected winds. 20 yards from the carnelian shell, a funnel detached from the closest dust engine and coalesced into a vertical spiral. Rust-colored flecks clinked inside it, producing the staccato rhythm of a locomotive's signal bell gone hoarse with age. The spiral shifted, revealing an interior aperture shaped exactly like a smokebox door. It hovered before the travelers in mute interrogation. Evan retrieved the copper monocle, its lens already tinted by the basin's glare. Holding it against the incoming light, he displaced the monocle until concentric rings etched into the glass aligned with the compass fissures on the dome. The lens refracted sunlight into a single vertical beam that pierced the spiral's core. Sand hissed into vapor, and the guardian vortex unwound in orderly layers, dispersing into harmless gusts that scurried across the dunes. Close inspection of the rose sphere revealed a small vent at its zenith, where heat escaped in distorted ripples. The travelers climbed a stepped buttress of sandstone, bolted to the dome by century-old iron brackets, remnants of a forgotten maintenance crew. At the summit, Mrs. Whitaker located an iris of overlapping stone petals centered around a spindle that jutted like the axle of a great gyroscope. She pressed the wind clock against the spindle. Magnets hidden in the brass clicked into alignment, and the minute hand slammed to mountain noon. Quartz light coursed down the spindle, flooding every fissure in the dome with quicksilver radiance. Deep inside the sphere, unseen gearing whirred to life, and the ambient roar of dust engines fell away as though someone had closed a throttling valve. Across the basin, the rogue cyclone slowed, fragmented, and settled into placid columns of air that drifted skyward before vanishing. The breathing dunes deflated into placid swells, firm enough to hold their own weight without trembling. Above, a high cirrus band dispersed and reorganized. A single current of cool mountain air swept over the travelers, flattening Lana's hair against her face and sending fine sand swirling off the dome in shimmering arcs. The clock detached from the spindle of its own accord, hands spinning freely again, but now they matched global standard rather than the valley's disordered pulse. Mrs. Whitaker stowed the instrument, noting a gentle tick where before there had been a rhythmic clatter. The fireflies buoyed upward, their amber lights reflecting off the rejuvenated carnelian facets, which glowed as though backlit by dawn. In the sudden peace, Lana realized she could hear a distant whisper of pine wind descending from an unseen escarpment beyond the horizon, evidence that atmospheric pathways had begun to realign. The mission's hardest work lay accomplished, yet the return journey remained. The quartz filament still tethered them to the tulip poplar, its faint tug reminding them that corridors of wind never stayed open forever. Collecting satchel and monocle, brushing sand from scorched boots, the trio prepared to retrace their luminous path across a valley no longer haunted by rusted locomotives of air, but guarded instead by the soft, restorative hush of steady breezes returning home. Chapter 6. The Return of the Winds and an Autumn Evening Beneath the Lantern. The portal's ellipse unfolded a final time in the attic's dusky air, no longer glowing with desert gold particles, but shimmering as though it had been carved from the clearest meltwater that ever coursed down a mountain ravine. A hush spread through the rafters as Lana, Evan, and Mrs. Whitaker crossed the threshold. Their boots touched familiar pine planks with the soft, definite sound of homecoming. Behind them, the translucent corridor narrowed, folded inward, and vanished without a whisper, leaving only the faint odor of sun-warmed sage that drifted for a heartbeat before surrendering to the sharper fragrance of Appalachian timber. Outside, Asheville rested beneath a honey-colored sunset. Peach and mandarin bands stretched above the blue ridge, their edges scalloped by lingering storm clouds, now tamed into gentle anvils. A solitary church bell tolled somewhere below, and its mellow resonance reached the attic through warped shingles, melding with the click of the latch as Evan settled the circular hatch into place. The brass bolts slid with a note of finality, sealing the aperture as neatly as if it had never breathed foreign air. Across the wide beams, the giant fireflies that had once escorted the cousins home drifted apart like slowly fading embers, each pulse of amber dimmed until the loft was lit only by the last angled rays poking through the dormer window. They descended the narrow staircase into a house already alive with autumn rituals. The scent of wood smoke curled along the hallway, carrying sparks of hickory and resin to meet the sweeter aromas blooming from the kitchen. Cornbread browned in a cast-iron skillet, its crust crackling as buttermilk bubbled beneath. Next to it, apples split open in a stoneware dish, releasing ribbons of cinnamon steam that wound around every corner of the room. In the hearth, beech logs shifted, exposing pockets of orange coal that sighed each time a draft teased the chimney. Mrs. Whitaker paused near the mantel, where framed photographs reflected the fire's dance. Her gloved hand slipped into a leather pouch and emerged with 2 vials the size of thimbles, their glass thin as onion skin. Within each vial coiled a pale, miniature whirlwind, the captured breath of a high ridge, now calmed to a gentle swirl. She pressed one into Lana's palm and the other into Evan's, the glass cool yet trembling with barely restrained motion. Wax seals glimmered with etched runes that resembled overlapping compass roses. The gift needed no spoken explanation. The cousins understood it as a promise that the roads they had traveled would remain open in memory whenever courage or wonder grew dim. Evening gathered outside, and with it came a clean wind sluicing down from craggy pinnacle. It seeped through the open sash and rustled the curtains, carrying the grassy scent of rain-washed meadows and the metallic hint of distant waterfalls. Leaves rasped together in the maples beyond the porch, each rustle a page turned in the long story of October. Fireflies, native to the pasture, rose above the garden fence in loose constellations, their green flashes echoing the deeper gold of their desert cousins. Lana placed the wind clock on the dining room windowsill, where it immediately caught a shaft of fading sunlight. The hour hand remained fixed at the mountain noon index, an eternal reminder of equilibrium restored. Its glass front gathered a film of condensation, and when she wiped it away, she saw, for an instant, her own reflection, overlaid with the desert's distant horizon, as if time inside the case observed two worlds at once. Meanwhile, Evan unrolled their grandfather's expedition map across the oak table. The paper's margins still bore coffee rings and penciled altitudes. But now 2 new red pins gleamed among the original constellations of brass. One marked a desert basin unnamed by conventional cartographers. The other, a tulip poplar clearing threaded by hidden stairways. He pressed the pins deeper into the cork backing, anchoring the fresh memories alongside earlier journeys chronicled by the old pilot. Dusk deepened. The kitchen ceiling glowed the color of ripe persimmons, then seeded to twilight violet. Outside, the porch lantern clicked on, casting a puddle of honeyed light across the flagstones, slick with recent rain. A single cedar rocking chair creaked in the mild breeze, welcoming the evening like an old friend. Beneath it, the first sugar maple leaves skittered in small circles, their orange faces catching the lantern's glow before lifting again into cooler currents. Inside, flames settled into a steady murmur and threw lattices of light across the floorboards. Lana set 2 mugs beneath the kettle's spout, filling the room with the comforting hiss of cocoa meeting stoneware. The cousins wrapped themselves in wool blankets and sank onto the rag rug before the hearth. The captured winds rested in their vials on the mantel, faintly swirling whenever a new gust tapped the chimney top, as though trading greetings with their freer kin in the treetops. No trace of sand remained on their boots, yet each grain of memory lodged bright and certain behind closed eyelids. While logs popped, the maples outside gave up more leaves to the breeze, spiraling them through the lantern's glow like slow sparks from a forge. In that mingling of homebound sounds, the hush of wind through branches, the tick of a steadfast clock, the hush of fireflies weaving midnight promises, Lana and Evan felt the full circle of the journey settle into place. The world beyond remained vast and folded with secrets, but every path, however distant or tangled, had already begun its quiet arc back to a porch light, a steaming mug, and the soft percussion of autumn rain on a timeless roof.